This is a video on variable scope and lifetime. Before I start talking about scope and lifetime, I would like to ask you a few questions. You have had at least one programming class already. You've most likely already taken VB.NET 1 and are probably in the process of taking VB.NET 2 if you haven't already taken it. You're probably looking forward to co-oping soon, and you most likely have VB.NET on your resume. So if this was a classroom, I'd say, how many people have VB.NET on your resume? Raise your hand. And pretty much everybody does. So let's pretend you're in the interview for a job right now. You're very happy. You've got a chance to earn some good money and get some good experience. So the interviewer looks at you and says, I see you have VB.NET and SQL on your resume. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being a newbie and 10 being an expert, how would you rate yourself in each of those areas? So I do this in all of my classes, and I make my students write down a number, and then I go around and check to make sure everybody's written something down. It's very important. You can't lie after you've got it written down. Now what I want you to all do is, on a scrap piece of paper somewhere, I want you to write down your skill level, your self-assessment of your abilities in VB and SQL. So 1 to 10, and do that right now. So go ahead and pause the video until you've gotten the score written down. And I'm serious about this. Really important. Many or most students write down a number from 6 to 8. Now in an interview, the interviewer needs to ascertain the level of programming abilities for the interviewee in one or more skill areas like VB, SQL, and or HTML. And the reason for that is that they've got a bunch of problems, and they need to make sure that your skill levels are at a minimum level to where you can solve those problems. Now the best way to do that is to start asking questions in each area. Usually the interviewer starts out with a few simple questions that get progressively harder until one of two things happens. First, the interviewer could run out of questions, which means the candidate's level of knowledge far surpasses what's required for the job. That's great. That's the desired outcome. Or the candidate could get 2 or 3 questions wrong, or it could say, I don't know the answer. Alright, that is not uncommon, especially at starting. So don't be afraid to say I don't know, or I don't know that well enough, especially if they're high level questions. Now I'm going to do that to you right now. If you wrote down a number 4 or higher, you should be able to answer the following questions without any hesitation. Are you ready? So I've got my little clock down here in the bottom right, so I'm going to time you. Are you ready? What are the different types of variable scope in VB.NET? You have 10 seconds. Explain how they are different. You have 20 seconds. Explain how to declare a variable at each level of scope. You have 20 seconds. And finally, give an example of how to declare a variable at each level of scope. And your time is up. Pretty brutal, huh? If you could not answer those questions in the time given, then you don't know the answer. Now, let's ask ourselves, how would that affect your score that you wrote down? That's right, it would bring it down a lot. If there were any ums and ahs and uhs or hesitations in your answers, then you didn't sound professional. How would that affect your score? That would probably bring it down too, right? If you couldn't answer those 4 simple questions, your knowledge of VB is a 3 or less on a scale of 1 to 10. Yep, that's how low you are. Good thing that wasn't a real interview. Now for those of you out there who put down that you know VB on a scale of 6 to 8, you don't know it that well. and I've got more questions just like that. So if you want to come find me, we can. I'll throw a few questions at you and time you and see how well you do. Now my next question is, do you want to do better in a real interview than you just did here in this fake one? I expect your answer is yes. So there's a few terms and concepts that you need to memorize. You need to know these 10 minutes after you're dead. If they hit you with the paddles and shock you back to life, you should be able to start reciting those definitions. Now that may be a bit of an exaggeration, but why do you need to know them that well? Because program is going to be your profession. You need to be able to clearly communicate your thoughts and ideas in technical terms to other programmers and your bosses. You must be able to describe a problem, explain why you think it's happening, and show your plan to others on how to fix it. So, for example, there's a problem getting the next highest ID across different threads. I think we should make a static wrapper class to encapsulate the logic. The class could have an integer property m_int highest ID that we could add a function, and we could add a function that would atomically increment and return the value. It would be thread safe and easy to implement. Plus the logic is centralized, so it would be easy to maintain and change in the future. Now, it's commonly what's referred to as technobabble, except that describes a real problem and a possible real solution for it. Now, I got barbecued in an interview back in late 1996, early 1997. It was ugly. They lit me on fire, roasted marshmallows over my flaming corpse, wheeled me out into the parking lot, hosed me off, and said thanks for coming. They asked me a bunch of questions. I knew the answers, but I couldn't articulate them because I hadn't burned them into my brain. My answers were fuzzy, kind of like probably some of you have a fuzzy idea of what variable scope is and variable lifetime. They put me on the spot. I got nervous, and I didn't get the job. Now that had a serious consequence with it. That job came with a paycheck that I did not get. Now the same thing will happen to you unless you are prepared. So how do you prepare? Well, you learn the material and you learn it well. Every time you have to learn some new term, definition, concept, or whatever, make some flashcards. Write the term down on one side and the definition on the other. Physically write it out so you have the muscle memory of doing so. Flashcards aren't for kids. Flashcards are for students, and if you haven't figured it out yet, in computers you'll always be learning. So in a way, you're a perpetual student. After my barbecuing experience, I went out the next day and bought 3 books. I read them cover to cover several times, and I memorized a bunch of definitions. I still have, hopefully, most if not all of those definitions memorized to this day. Now, fortunately, my barbecuing experience has not been repeated, but it's an ongoing process. It's a process of keeping your skills up to date, and that takes work. Now, you are learning Visual Studio perhaps for the first time, but I started on Visual Studio 6.0. Then I switched to Visual Studio.net. Yes, I was around before .net. Then after I learned that, they came out with Visual Studio 2000. Oh no, maybe it was 2003. Yeah, I don't think it was 2000. I think it was just 2003. Then there was Visual Studio.net 2005, then 2008, then 2010, and most recently 2012. Now the difference in quirks from one version to the next can be very challenging to learn and talk about a lot of headaches. But that is part of programming. That's what we do. And no matter how well you know stuff, remember there's always going to be someone that knows more than you. Try never to get mad when someone else knows more than you. It's going to happen. Look at it as an opportunity to improve yourself. I remember a guy on my first job. His name was Bill Kilgallen. I was on a project with a very smart lady, but we were stuck. My boss brought in Bill. Bill sat down, whipped out a fancy pen, and had us unstuck in 10 or 15 minutes. Boy, I was upset. I mean, he made it look so easy, and it was so common sense. But 15 minutes earlier, I couldn't see it. So I went off in a corner and fumed for about 5 minutes, and then I decided I was going to copy everything this guy did because he was a professional and he made it look, he did a great job. When he was talking to us, he'd recommended a book, which I went out and bought and read. Now, it's one of the heaviest reads I've ever had, and it is extremely technical. But it was a good read, and I learned from it. I went out and I bought a fancy pen like he had and had my name engraved on it, and I started emulating a professional because I wanted to be the go-to guy. Now, that mindset of trying to emulate professionals and let the people that succeed around you do what they do It's been almost 20 years, and that strategy of continuous learning by myself and from others has paid off very, very well. And you wouldn't believe the amount I've learned from students. Some days I learn more than you guys do. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. So you need to keep this learning mindset, and when you find new concepts, you really need to work hard to commit them to memory. So, with that as an introduction, how would you like to answer to those questions that I asked you? Scope is a programming term used to define from where in a program a variable can be accessed. In most programming languages, there are 3 levels of variable scope: global, form, class, or module, and procedure or local. So often form, class, and module level variable scope are used interchangeably. So someone might say class level and they're talking about a form, or they might say module level. They're all pretty much the same thing. Procedure and local are also synonyms. If you say a procedure variable or a local variable, they mean the same thing. I'm going to talk about scope and lifetime for both VB.NET and C. Why? Because I hope to use this video in both my VB and C classes that I teach, so it's a little less work. Also, most of you know VB better than you know C. So if I show you the equivalent in VB, it will be easier for you to learn it in C. At least that's the theory. So for those of you in VB.NET that are wondering why this C stuff is in here, now you know. Variables with global scope can be accessed from anywhere in the project, and these are very dangerous. Why? If they can be changed from anywhere in the code, they will be changed. You might call a procedure 10 levels down, and when it returns, all the values in your variables have been changed. Think it can't happen? You're wrong, and it will happen if you don't decide now to never use them. They are really, really dangerous. I like to use this example to illustrate what I'm talking about. Imagine if you lived in an apartment all by yourself with one dresser, one laundry basket, and one washing machine and dryer. Would you have any problems with your clothes? No, you wouldn't. Now, how would it be if you shared the same apartment with 5 other people? At least one of those was a complete neat freak, and 2 were total slobs. At least 2 are females, and the rest are males. How do you think the laundry situation would be sharing that one dresser, that one laundry basket, that one washing machine, and that one dryer? Yeah, it would be a nightmare. That's what global variables are like. Everything gets all mixed up. You don't want one. That's why global variables are evil. Don't make or use them. Global constants and procedures are okay because they don't change. Global variables can change, and that can cause bugs that are extremely difficult to track down. Variables with form, class, or module scope can be accessed only within the form, class, or module in which they were declared. In VB.NET, do you know what the difference between a form and a class is? Basically nothing. A form is a class. I like to say a form is a class with visual components. You can see it, but it's still just a class. Now, do you know what the difference between a class and a module is? These are great interview questions, by the way. A module is a class with one and only one instance. Sometimes that's referred to as a singleton or a static class. I use static classes a lot in both C# and Java. Variables with local, sometimes called procedure scope, can be accessed only within the procedure in which they were declared. Most of your variables should be local. Now, how do you know when you should have a procedure or a form, class, or module level variable? Well, when the contents of the variable must be preserved after the end of the procedure so that it can be accessed later in the same or different procedure. So how do we declare variables at the different levels of scope? In VB.NET, global variables are declared using the dim or public keyword inside a form, class, or module, but outside of a procedure. So again, dim or public inside a form, class, or module, but outside a procedure. So there's 3 pieces to that. The keyword, and it's got to be in a form, class, or module. That's the second part, but the third part is got to be outside of a procedure. In VB.NET, form, class, or module variables are declared using the private keyword inside of a form, class, or module, but outside of a procedure. So the difference between global and form, class, or module level variables: global is used dim or public, and form, class, or module use private. Now always declare your variables at the top, even though you can put them anywhere, even at the bottom. You don't want variables at the bottom of your code. Why? Because it's hard to read. Your code should be like a playbill at the theater. The first thing you should see is a list of the actors and then a description of what's going to happen. So our variables are our actors, and then we get the code or the instructions that tell us what happens. And in VB.NET, local or procedure variables are declared using the dim keyword inside of a procedure. In C, global variables are any variables declared outside of a procedure. Now there are no classes in C, so you can't have a form, class, or module level variable. In C, local or procedure variables are any variables declared inside of a procedure. Here's an example of how to declare a variable at each level of scope in VB.NET. So notice I'm inside of a class, public class F main. Now F stands for form, so it's a form, and I use the dim keyword for a variable. It is inside the class but outside a procedure. Next I have a form level variable. I use the private keyword inside of a class but outside of a procedure. And finally I use the dim keyword for a variable inside a procedure. That's what makes it a local or procedure level variable. Notice that global variable has been declared as evil. The prefix for form, class, or module level variables is usually M underscore. The reason it's used is to differentiate form, class, or module level variables from local variables. The M in the M underscore stands for member of and comes from object-oriented programming terminology. It's just something that's been around for a long time. Now sometimes I'll use an F underscore for form variables and instead of M underscore. I should probably be a little more consistent on that, but just as long as you are project consistent, it's usually okay. Now, can anyone guess what prefix we use for global variables? You know what prefix we use? No, it's not G underscore. It's nothing, because we don't use global variables. Isn't that a great trick question? Here is an example of how to declare global and procedure variables in C. So notice I put the data type and then the global variable name and then the data type. You'll notice that the data type is evil and we initialize it to disaster. And then here is a local or procedure level variable. Lifetime is a programming term used to define how long the contents of a variable are preserved in memory. The lifetime of a variable is not the same thing as the scope of a variable. Again, lifetime is how long the contents are preserved, and scope is from where the contents of the variable can be accessed. So how long versus from where. In VB.NET, the contents of a global variable are preserved as long as the form, class, or module in which it was declared is open. Most programmers or students mistakenly believe that global variables last as long as the program is open. That is incorrect. It's only as long as the form, class, or module in which the variable was declared in is open. In VB.NET, the contents of a form, class, or module variable are again preserved as long as the form, class, or module in which it was declared is open. That was the easy one. The tough one is the global. And in VB.NET, the contents of a local or procedure variable are preserved until the end of the procedure. As soon as the last line of the code in the procedure is executed, anything declared in the procedure goes out of scope. That's the technical term, and is therefore deleted from memory. So to give you an example of global, let's say you have a main form, form A, and a child form, form B. You click a button on form A that displays an instance of form B modally. Form B has a global variable in it. The contents of that variable are preserved as long as form B is open. And as soon as the form B instance is closed, the variable goes out of scope and its contents are lost. So let me show you that example. So here I am in Visual Studio. I got Form A up top of the button that says Show Form B. And down at the bottom I've got Form B that says Chain Value. If I look at the code for Form A, when you click the Show Form B button, it declares a variable of type Form B. It makes an instance. We show that modally. That's show dialog versus just show, which shows modelessly. If you don't know the difference between showing modally and modelessly, your score in VB just went down. So you should be able to give me in 1 or 2 sentences the difference between those. Are you ready? Show modally means the forms are stacked one on top of the other. You can't get to a form behind one in front unless you close the one in front. And when they are shown modelessly, they are side by side and you can switch from one form to the other without having to close anything. So we show that modally, which means it's stacked, and then we're all done. We delete our reference to Form B. Let's go look at the code for Form B. You can see I've got a global variable, and we'll initialize it to 0 to start. And every time you click that button, change the value, it's going to show us what the old value was. It's going to add 1 to it, and then it's going to show us what the new value. So let's go ahead and run our program and see what happens. So here's our form. I show Form B, it pops up, and I'm going to change the value. It was 0, and now it's 1. That's great. That's exactly what it's supposed to. It was 1, that's right, and now it should be 2. That is correct. Now I'm going to close the form. Now, even though this is a global variable, it lives inside of Form B, and when I close that, and then I come back, this is another instance of Form B, and it's been reset to 0. So that proves that global variables live only as long as the form, class, or module in which they were declared is open. In C, the lifetime of a global variable is as long as the program is running. As soon as the main procedure ends, all global variables go out of scope. In C, the lifetime of a procedure variable is until the end of the procedure, which is just like VB.NET. So let's answer these questions and bring up our clock so that we can time ourselves on this. So, what are the different types of variable scopes in VB.NET? Why, that's simple. Global, form, class, or module, and procedure or local. Explain how they're different. Global variables can be accessed from anywhere inside the project. Form, class, or module level variables can be accessed only within the form, class, or module in which they were declared, and local or procedure variables can be accessed only in the procedure in which they were declared. Then explain how to declare a variable at each level. Well, global, use the dim or public keyword inside a form, class, or module, but outside of a procedure. For form, class, or module level variables, use the private keyword inside a form, class, or module, but outside of a procedure. And finally, local variables, use the dim keyword inside a procedure. And then give an example of how to declare each one. Well, I'll let you write that down on a piece of paper somewhere, just like the little example I had before. What is the lifetime of a variable? Lifetime is a programming term that's used to define how long the contents of a variable are preserved in memory, and the difference between the different levels, global and form variables, are the contents are preserved as long as the form in which they were declared is open, and the lifetime of a local variable is until the end of a procedure. So that's it. Much faster, much better, and I think we're ready for an interview, except I left off the actual question, variable scope. That should be on there. So what is variable scope? Variable scope is a programming term used to define from where a variable can be accessed. So in summary, you should now understand what the scope and lifetime of variables are. You should have those definitions burned into your memory, and you should use this learning experience as a guide for your future study habits. If you knew all those terms and you could recite them, hey, guess what? Your study habits are great. If you couldn't recite those terms in the times allowed, your study habits need some work. Now, it's in your best interest to learn this material. I'm not telling you this for my benefit. I've already been blessed with a super amazingly great job. This material is so that hopefully you can do as well or even better than me, and that's my That's my hope for you. So that is the end of this video.